We want to build a realistic model of the economy. But what's realistic? We've already seen that the current crop of standard economic models exclude the important characteristics of the economy that we're actually interested in by design, and also use the most unrealistic ideas of people's economic behaviour. All models are wrong, but some are useful, as the saying goes, and we would clearly like to construct a useful one. To be useful, we have to know what are the aims that the model is supposed to help us with. So first of all, let's examine what macroeconomists have generally considered to be the main aims of macroeconomics. Ray Fair, writing in an article called "Has Macro Progressed?", said, "The main goal of macro from the beginning has been to explain the entire economy, to develop models that can explain well fluctuations in all the key economic variables." Well, this is a start. It clearly shows that we need to model the entire economy, all the important features of an economy, but what exactly are those? And we're interested in fluctuations, but that doesn't really specify whether they're big or small. So let's look at another indication of what macroeconomics should do from Joseph Stiglitz. He says, "The most important challenge facing any macro model is to provide insights into the deep downturns that have occurred repeatedly and what should be done in response." So this is a bit of a clarification. We're really interested in big fluctuations, deep downturns. And finally, for a further point of view, let's look at a working paper from the Bank for International Settlements. And this one's called "The Financial Cycle and Macroeconomics, What Have We Learnt?" Paper suggests some essential features for macroeconomic model. The first essential feature is that the financial boom should not just precede the bust, but cause it. The boom sows the seeds of the subsequent bust. So they're saying that any good model of the macroeconomy must include booms and busts, and there must be a causal link. The fact that we have a boom leads to the bust. The second essential feature, they say, is the presence of debt. During the financial boom, credit plays a facilitating role, allows expenditures to take place and assets to be purchased. However, as the boom turns to bust, debt becomes a forcing variable as economic agents cut their expenditures in order to repair their balance sheets. So they're saying that we should be looking at booms and busts, and that debt should be an important explanatory factor, certainly in the case of busts. As we've seen in the previous video, current standard macroeconomic models assume that cycles, business cycles, booms and busts, are a result of random shocks to the economy. These are things that come from outside of the economy and impact it in peculiar ways that nobody can forecast. It's what in the 17th century they would have called a deus ex machina explanation. The gods come along and do something to fix your model for you. Not very convincing. So what we want to do is to have a model, and the aim of the model is that it should contain dynamics of booms and busts over time, and it should show how that economy contains the seeds of its own periods of recession, with debt as a major causal factor within it. Clearly, we need a dynamic model, one that will encompass booms and busts, and not a static or equilibrium model as the current tendency seems to be. So now let's just consider what sort of a world we should be modelling. We want to keep it very simple. Oliver Blanchard, another famous economist, said that models should capture what we believe are the macro-essential characteristics of the behaviour of firms and people, and not try to capture all relevant dynamics. Only then can they serve their purpose, remain simple enough, and provide a platform for theoretical discussions. So, keep it simple, stupid, is the recommendation. So let's just keep our initial model to a very simple sort of economy. It'll only have these minimal elements. One set of workers, one set of firms or the owners of firms, one product being produced, and one bank to deal with money. It's a completely closed economy. You can imagine this, for example, as a sort of desert island with a potato economy. The thing that's being produced, potato, is something that could be consumed, eaten, or invested, planted in the earth to grow new potatoes. So the choice every year is always how much of the crop to eat and how much to invest, i.e. rebury, to grow the future potatoes. Now, obviously this is an extremely simple economy and it can be extended in the future by adding different sectors, different sorts of products, etc. But for the moment, we'll just look at the dynamics that result from such a simple economy. We can consider it, in fact, as a very simple example of an agent-based model. An agent-based model, ABM, is a set of actors, each with its own behaviour, and these various actors are allowed in the model to converse, to interact with each other, and then we see what happens as a result of their interactions. The whole system is built up from the individual behaviours of its constituent parts. Okay, so that's the aim of the model and the very simple world that we'll build the model to replicate. So now, what sort of behaviours should the actors in this model have? Well, we want them to be plausible, that is to say realistic, the sort of behaviours, the sort of decision making that people show in the real world. Now, we'll use two approaches in order to decide how to model the behaviours, and the first is the use of heuristics. Heuristics is just a general term to mean any shortcut decision making which does not fully and rationally lay out all the alternatives, all the probabilities associated, all the gains and losses that could occur, and mathematically put them all together to make some wonderful chess-like perfect decision. Evidently, people do not make perfect decisions. They think simply, they react to others, they do things quickly. These are heuristics. And the two perhaps most fundamental, earliest reported heuristics are these. The first is availability. People tend to base their decisions on information that's readily available at the time. They don't go and sit for 6 weeks in a library trying to sort out all the available information that could be relevant to a decision. Typically, things that are available at a given time are things that are happening now. So it tends to result in decision making in the now, not looking back deeply into history, not looking forwards deeply into what might happen in the future, but what's happening now. The second important heuristic is anchoring, and this is the fact that people tend, having made one decision, to stick fairly closely to it. They can change their minds, they can change their actions, but they tend to do it in relatively small steps rather than making complete U-turns. So we're going to use these two sorts of heuristic: availability, things that are available in the now; anchoring, not making giant leaps but changing decisions slowly from what we've done before in order to determine the behaviour of the actors in our simple model. For the sake of ease of reference, I'll call this myopic decision making, short-sighted, simple decision making. However, even though people may be making these simple decisions on a limited set of information, how they make the final decision, or what final decision they make, depends upon their state of mind. In the real world, many things are extremely uncertain. Because things are extremely uncertain, people essentially have to take a gamble. They don't know what's going to happen. They have to make some assumption things will turn out well or they won't. The decision they take depends upon their state of mind, whether it's optimistic or pessimistic, and this will affect the actual decision they arrive at. John Maynard Keynes famously talked about animal spirits, the same thing as confidence, and as he said, most of our decisions can only be taken as a result of animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action, and not as a calculated outcome of quantitative benefits multiplied by probabilities. So we're going to use these two aspects of real-life decision-making, simple myopic heuristics, together with confidence to determine what decisions people make in the model. So, having decided on these principles of what to model and how things should behave within the model, we now need to put these principles into real effect in some detail. So the first thing to do is to go through the key elements that we're going to need within our model world. And these key elements that we'll go through separately are, first of all, confidence, animal spirits. Secondly, money and credit. Thirdly, what are the behaviours of the owners and the workers within our model? Fourthly, how do capacity build-ups and production levels work? Fifthly, prices. How do prices get set? And finally, we'll look at interest rates and balances of people's accounts and whether they're in debt. So let's look at these one by one. So the first question is how to deal with confidence, or animal spirits. We'll refer to them as spirits. A subjective feeling, and it's seen perhaps in its rawest form in the stock market. Stock market prices go up and down, a bit like yo-yos, and very often these are not driven by any factual change in the underlying capability or performance of firms. They're driven by sentiment. Spirits feed on themselves. Again, if we look at the stock market, we often see this concept of momentum. A stock whose price has gone up for a day or two may well continue to go up for the next few days simply because other people, having seen the price go up, assume that it will continue in the same direction. So the fact that people felt confident about this stock to push the price up then leads to other people feeling confident, and the general level of confidence spirals upwards. So the level of spirits can very easily depart from whatever the fundamental underlying level of the economy might be. We model spirits to replicate this sort of effect. When the economy is doing reasonably well, then spirits tend to increase. So if the economy does reasonably well over a period of several years, the spirits will slowly grow to a higher level. Even though the economy is not improved, the mere fact that it's maintained a good state, a healthy state, for a longer period will make confidence grow. We'll put spirits on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is absolutely no confidence and 100 is perfect confidence. 50 is absolutely neutral. Above 50 means people are feeling confident. Below 50 means people are not feeling confident. At each period, the spirits will be adjusted. We'll multiply the previous level of spirits, that's the anchor, using our anchoring heuristic, by a factor which summarizes the health of the economy at present, and that's going to be measured by the GDP level, inflation, interest rate, and debt levels. And this multiplying factor will be greater than 1 if the economy is doing well, and less than 1 if the economy is doing badly, so that the level of spirits will be adjusted upwards or downwards correspondingly. As the spirits get closer to 100, any upward adjustment will be faded off so that it will take a bigger increase in the health of the economy to make a significant difference in the level of the spirits. On the other hand, if spirits are already quite high and in one period the economy performs worse, that will make quite a big downward jump to the level of spirits. And again, because this is a simple model, some factors that are probably important to spirits, let's say the unemployment level, they are omitted at the moment, but of course could be included in a more complex future version of the model. Now let's look at money and credit. Economists can't really agree on how money is created. There are three widely accepted theories of money creation, and none of them agree with each other, and this is what they are. The first one is usually called intermediation, that banks are there simply to take money from one set of people and to give it to other sets of people. Typically, they take it from consumers and give it to businesses. So the banks play no part at all in money creation. Second theory is the money multiplier theory, that the banking system does create money through the money multiplier determined by commercial banks' reserve ratio, which is a thing controlled by the central bank. And essentially this means that banks are allowed to lend out more money than they collect in. So in that process they are sort of creating money. And the third theory, the endogenous money theory, says that banks can create money independently from the central bank through lending, which is to say that there's no real restriction on them and they can lend as much as they like, and in doing so they create money. Well, we're going to basically bend towards the third of those theories, but essentially we will shortcut all these arguments by looking into the future. Money is becoming a purely electronic record. Actual physical cash is clearly being slowly phased out, and in the near future, money will simply be electronic records of transactions between people held on computers. Since lending is simply changing an electronic entry on a balance sheet, banks can lend whatever they like, subject to their own assessment of the risk of lending money to people. They will charge interest, of course, on the loans they make, and the interest is yet another electronic balance sheet entry. And workers and firms can ask to borrow whatever they like, and they'll be granted some of it, or all of it, or none of it, depending upon the risk that the bank thinks they present. So following the myopic behaviour principle, the amount that the bank will grant when asked is simply a function of the current debt-to-income ratio of the asker, the worker or the firm owner. How much credit that they actually ask for is going to be based on their income in the last period. And clearly, if your income is $100, you'll be unlikely to be expecting a loan of $100,000, plus the level of their spirits and the balance between the desire to consume or invest, i.e. to spend, and the desire to keep their existing debt down to a reasonable level. So they'll have to balance these three things in their decision making. What's my current income? How much debt do I have? And how much do I want, ideally, to spend? Let's turn to the owners and workers within the model. We just have these two classes of people: firms, which are run by their owners, and workers who work for the firms or can be unemployed. Workers will myopically attempt to spend all of their income and any credit they've borrowed on consumption. So workers simply consume. They may not be able to spend it all if there's not enough production in the economy to allow them to, but they'll try to spend it. And owners, on the other hand, put a lot of their income and credit into investment, and the amount they don't put into investment, they will also attempt to spend on consumption. Now, to begin a period of time in this model, we start with a firm or a worker having the income from the last period just arriving in their bank account. So this is like a monthly paid worker. At the beginning of a month, they've just received their wages for the last month, so they have those to spend. Now, either a firm or a worker can then decide either to spend exactly what they received from their last month's wages, or to augment that by taking further credit to spend on top of those previous month's income, or to put some of that previous month's income back into the bank to pay down any debts that they might have. And again, in the myopic spirit of the behaviours we've decided for this sort of model, they will decide to borrow more money simply as a function of their spirits. The higher the spirits, the more they're likely to want to borrow. But if they've got existing debt, then debt weighs on their situation because there's a direct cost of paying interest that they owe on that debt, and it also constrains the amount that a bank is willing to let them borrow. So they will typically wish to keep debt down to a reasonable level. And how much they might want to repay of their existing debt, we will again have a very simple myopic decision rule, which is that depends upon the level of the debt. The debt to income ratio that they have, which just says how big the debt is compared to their normal income, and how much they're having to pay out each month as interest payments, again as a proportion of their income. That will depend upon the interest rate prevailing at the time. So those two things are put together to decide how much they would ideally like to repay of the debt they have. Now, these two trains of thought, the one that says my spirits are high, I'd like to borrow and spend more, and the one that says my debt is high, I'd like to save and reduce that debt, they conflict. So we put these two trains of thought together and we simply decide to borrow and spend more, or not to borrow and in fact to save and reduce debt by looking at which of the two is the bigger amount. If the intention, the ideal liking is to borrow a big amount, but we only want to repay a small amount, then we borrow. If on the other hand, we would really like to repay a large amount, but we only want to borrow a small amount, then we'll go with the repay side. Once we've decided whether we're borrowing more or repaying, then a worker will attempt to spend all of the money they have available, which is either previous month's wages plus a bit of borrowing, or previous month's wages minus however much they've put aside for repayments. They will attempt to spend all of that remaining amount on consumption. Owners, on the other hand, will look at the amount they've got to spend and decide to divide that up. Some of it they will spend on consumption, like the workers, but the rest of it they will put into investment to grow their firms. How much do owners put into investment versus consumption? Well, we start off with an anchor, a fixed amount, say 60%, which is the normal amount that they will put into investment of the money they have available to spend. And this will be adjusted myopically depending upon the supply and demand situation. That is, last period, did we have unsold products left over? In which case the demand was lower than the supply, or could we have sold more products than we actually had available? In which case the demand was greater than the supply. If the demand was greater than the supply, then we will put more of our available money into investment. If it was lower, then we will put less of our available money into investment. Revenue for firms is the total amount of expenditure from both owners and workers in the previous period. Now, that revenue is then divided between the owners, who keep some of it, and the workers who get their wages out of that revenue. How much do the workers get from the total revenue? Well, that's a very complicated socio-economic question. Depends a lot about the history of the country, how much bargaining power workers have compared to owners, historical levels, politics, and in fact many other factors that there's no chance that we can include in a simple economic model. So for the purposes of this model, we will simply take a fixed proportion and we will say that workers get, let's say, 60% of the pot. So 60% of revenue goes to workers, the remaining 40% remains with the firms. The fourth thing we need to consider in our model is the issue of capacity to produce and actual production of goods. Now, capacity to produce includes things like machines, knowledge, organization, business models, things which have been built up over time via the investment of money and time into working them out. The only actual thing in this model being used in the production process is workers' labour. We don't separately have a treatment for the materials that would be used. Essentially, we will assume that any materials are freely available and at zero cost. Obviously, this is unrealistic, but again, for the moment, this allows us to simplify the model, only having labour as the input. As we saw before, the owners will have decided the number of dollars they have available this period to invest. Now, that amount will be converted into an impact on the capacity of the economy. In order to do that, we will simply take the real value, that is, we will remove the effects of inflation, so that a dollar investment now will buy less in terms of increased capacity than a dollar investment would have done 10 periods ago. If we do not continually invest in capacity, then it will deteriorate. There will be depreciation, and we assume a fixed amount, say 5% per year, of depreciation of the capacity of the economy in the absence of any investment. Finally, the production of the economy is simply proportional to the capacity. And we measure the GDP of the economy as the volume of products sold. So that is essentially the real value of the sales, having removed the inflation effects. Now let's move to considering prices. Prices are mainly determined from the supply and demand situation. If in the last period we could have sold more than was available, then prices, which are anchored around the price we had last period, will slightly move up by some percentage depending upon how large the supply and demand gap actually was. If, on the other hand, last period we had unsold goods, then the price will myopically go down a little, again depending upon the size of that supply and demand gap. And prices are also affected to a small extent by the level of spirits, but the supply and demand situation is the overriding factor. So notice this model we're constructing does not assume any form of market clearance. We don't expect sales to always exactly equal production. Usually we expect there will be some unsold products or there will be some unmet demand. This is the normal situation, and the production, the investments will slowly adapt to that situation, but they may never actually meet it. And finally, the last two things we want to look at for this model are interest rates and bank balances. So interest is charged to owners and to workers on credit that they take out in the period and on any debt in their account balances. There's a base interest rate which is just set at slightly above, a few percent above inflation. And then there's the actual charged interest rate, which is the base rate plus an additional amount depending on the risk of the borrower. That is, depending on their debt to income ratio. So interest rates track inflation, keep a bit ahead of it, and go up if you're a risky high debt customer. The government or central bank may choose to interfere and adjust the interest rate itself as a policy decision, and that's what it would typically do if it was trying to fight inflation or perhaps to try and jumpstart growth, but that we'll come to a little later. In the minimal model, no interest is paid for positive balances in the bank, and there's no notion of actively saving for a rainy day. The only reason to save is to reduce debt levels. Again, these are things which we will come back to in more advanced versions of the model. At the end of each period, the owners and the workers' account balances are updated. The new balance will be the previous balance minus however much they've spent this period, which is the previous period's income plus any credit they've asked for, plus the income they get this period, and minus the interest which has been charged to them in this period. So those balances update, and if they are negative, you've got debt. And if you've got debt, you've got a debt to income ratio, and that's important in deciding the amount that you can borrow and the interest rate that you'll be charged in the next period. So now we've explained all the key elements that go into this basic simple model based on spirits and on sensible, realistic human behaviour. Let's look at the overall model. Here's a schematic putting together the various bits we've been explaining. You can see, starting at the top, that we have initially spirits, which are anchored in the last period spirits, and then moved up or down depending upon the factors of inflation, GDP, debt, and interest rate in the last period. Those spirits then affect the desired amount that people want to borrow, and that's also affected on the investment side by the supply and demand situation, and of course it's again anchored in last period's income. The debt to income ratio of people also determines the amount that they would like to save this period, if any. So we've now got two things: the desired amount they'd like to borrow on the one hand and the desired amount they'd like to save on the other. That gives us the actual amount they're going to borrow or save in this period, and that amount is then added to last period's income to give the spendable amount, which is divided for owners between investment spend and consumption spend. For workers, it's entirely consumption spend. Now, the investment spend feeds into capacity, and that's also affected by levels of depreciation, and as the capacity changes, so does the amount we can produce this period. And finally, that production amount will feed back to update the supply and demand situation. Then, given the amounts that people are actually going to spend either on investment or on consumption this period, and the price, which itself has been updated by supply and demand, we get to the total dollar sales for the period. And those dollar sales are then distributed between the owners as their income and the workers as their income, their wages. Finally, that means that the bank balances of both owners and workers change, and they may or may not now be in debt, and that possible debt will feed back to the top of the diagram into the debt amounts and the interest rate. So the whole cycle will then repeat, and we can go from period to period seeing what actually happens to the economy as it evolves over time. So again, there's no concept of stability or equilibrium. This economy is going to grow, to shrink, to change, and we will watch it happen. So let's move to a computer implementation of this model and see what actually happens. First, let's see what happens if essentially we take out spirits from the whole model. We'll set spirits equal always to 50. If you remember, that is the balance point where people are neither optimistic nor pessimistic, and as a result they're not inclined to borrow and they're not inclined to save. They'll just generally spend the amount of money they got in from their last period. Well, if we do that, we'll watch the economy evolve as it's doing now, and you can see that it grows, and it grows very slowly. This is because there is some investment being made, and therefore capacity does slowly increase, and that allows the economy as a whole, the GDP, to grow. But essentially, it's a very small amount of growth. We don't get any of the fluctuations that we're interested in. Cast your mind back to the aims. We're interested in periods of growth which cause the seeds of their own destruction in subsequent recessions. We don't see that in this constant spirits of 50 model. Okay, so now let's say what would happen if instead of being always 50, we put the spirits up to a positive amount. Let's say they're always 70. So if we rerun the model, but now with spirits a bit more positive the whole way through at a level, fixed level of 70, we'll see what happens here. And what happens here is that we get very impressive growth. The positive confidence feeds through into the economy. People borrow more and more. Each period, the economy grows more and more. So here we have a very happy situation where the economy, in a sense, is ideal. It's undisturbed by any excess growth. It's undisturbed by any recessions. It grows smoothly and quickly over time, and basically everybody is happy. This would be an ideal situation. Unfortunately, ideal situations don't normally happen in real life. So now let's do what we always intended to do and set the spirits free to adapt themselves to the state of the economy as it is at any given time. So we now allow the spirits to move up or down depending upon those various factors such as GDP, inflation, interest rates over time. Let's see what happens as we now run the model, and we will be able to see that after a while the debt to income ratios grow. This means that eventually people decide their debt is too high and they will cut back on their spending in order to reduce debt. As they do this, confidence will fall, and there's a sort of spiral effect whereby for a while the whole economy goes down. People spend less, they're less confident, the economy contracts. Then after a while, debt levels have reduced, people feel able to borrow again, and the economy recovers. It picks up again from where it was, and we see that there's a period of growth until debt levels rise again and there's another recession. So, casting our minds back to the beginning of this video, the aim was to explain the observed fact that we do get periods of growth and periods of recession, business cycles in real economies. This is not explained by current standard economic models. And here we have a very simple economic model based on principles that confidence drives an economy and that people behave in common sense, simple ways, and our model here does produce business cycles. It does produce periods of growth, and those periods of growth do contain the seeds of their own destruction because they make debt rise, and as debt rises it becomes unsustainable. People take action to reduce it, and that then puts the economy into a recession. It spirals down until debt is reduced, people can then borrow again, and the economy will start to recover. And this is a repeated cycle over long time periods. So, a very simple model based on common sense approach to how people behave is capable of producing the realistic results, the sort of things that we observe in real economies. We will then in the following videos go on to look at what sort of implications this has for economic policy. What are the things we should do under certain economic conditions? What can governments do and central banks in order to keep the economy as far as possible on a smoothly growing growth